Next up in our AFC South preview, I have the Indianapolis Colts. The Colts this year are projected 9.5 wins. In terms of this offseason, their offseason was quite ridiculous. They bludgeon Carson Wentz on his way out of town. Jim Irsay is basically talking nonstop shit about this guy as he leaves the franchise, how he's not really a leader, how he's not really the guy that they thought they were getting, that they lose their defensive coordinator who really did a lot with this unit, Matty Berfoulis, who's now the head coach of the Bears. However, they bring in some decent players, Yannick Ngakoue from the Raiders. They bring in Matt Ryan. They bring in Stephon Gilmore. These are win-now moves. These are not, we're playing for a few years from now moves. You bring in Matt Ryan, who has had a few down years with the Falcons, but last year, he has not been the problem with these Falcons teams. He has been a decent to good starting quarterback on some piss poor rosters. He was throwing to YMCA guys last year. And you know what? I, for one, am relatively high on Matt Ryan still as a passer. On top of Carson Wentz getting kicked out of town, they lose Zach Pascal, they lose Xavier Rhodes, they also lose T.Y. Hilton and their longtime tight end, Jack Doyle. So this receiving corps is just looking very differently than it has in the last several years. With Berfoulis leaving, they bring in Gus Bradley from the Raiders. This is a guy who's been around the block as a former head coach. I love former head coaches who find their way into defensive coordinator situations because typically the results are pretty good, with few exceptions. When some of these head coaches sort of flame out and end up back in the coordinatorship worlds, a lot of times these guys are sort of chomping at the bit to show people that they still have it. Gus Bradley, I think, has the potential here to lead a good, strong defensive unit. The talent is obviously there. Gus Bradley plays this cover 3 defensive scheme that really tries to take away one side of the field. They rely heavily on one corner typically, and I think that Gus Bradley is sort of a perfect fit for what Stephon Gilmore does. I don't think it's a natural sort of relationship with what Bradley was running with Richard Sherman back in the day, but Gilmore is still a hell of a player. We're talking about a former defensive player of the year here. So the Colts brought in a former defensive player of the year and a former MVP this offseason. There aren't many teams who can say that. In looking at this Colts roster, I can't help but think that they are pushing all their chips to the middle of the table in a way that the Titans just really are not. And I appreciate the fact that the Colts sort of face a difficult situation if this strategy does not play out. They've brought in another old quarterback to hopefully bring this team deep into the playoffs. They've essentially been trying to do what the Rams did last year by bringing in Stafford for like 5 years now, and it hasn't worked out yet. So if Matt Ryan could be something of an improvement on Carson Wentz, then we could be talking about a team that is really dangerous, a dangerous out in this AFC playoffs. I think based on how I'm talking about them now, you may have picked up that I'm pretty high on this Colts team. Their odds right now to win the AFC South are -110. Their projected win total, as I mentioned before, is 9.5, same as the Titans. It seems that the books are pretty similar to me in terms of where I think this will end up. I have the Colts going over their projected win total of 9.5 games, and I have them going over pretty easily. I think this is an 11 or 12 win team, honestly, because I just love what they did in the offseason. I love this roster even before the Matt Ryan acquisition. I think Carson Wentz sort of was unfairly maligned for some of that late season collapse. The Jaguars' loss, obviously, to keep the Colts out of the playoffs last year was, to me, as much about their defense being unable to stop a pitiful Jaguars offense as it was about Carson Wentz completely imploding in the worst possible moments. For all the flack that Wentz has gotten on his way out the door, this is a guy who threw for 27 touchdowns and 7 interceptions last year. He wasn't a schlep. He just completely was untrusted by this coaching staff by the second half of the season. They were throwing the shit out of the ball in the early part of the year, and by the time the second half sort of came around, this offense figured out that they couldn't really trust Wentz to not turn the ball over, so they relied more heavily on that rushing offense. I mentioned how there's not a lot of depth in that receiver room right before, but someone who is there is Michael Pittman, an emerging, who I believe a star receiver, an emerging star receiver. This guy was so good last year with Wentz. He really showed why the Colts took him in the first or second round 2 years ago. And I think that with Matt Ryan, he continues to develop into a superstar. Matt Ryan, for all his flaws, has been amazing at producing star to superstar level receivers over the last several years. People forget how good Calvin Ridley was 2 years ago because he was quitting on football and just being weird last year. But 2 years ago, he was one of the best receivers in the league. And before that, obviously, we had Julio Jones, a long time, one of the best receivers in the league. Matt Ryan has produced with guys like Harry Douglas. All sorts of receivers have just excelled with Matt Ryan. And I think that Michael Pittman is going to be the next in that line. I think Pittman is going to go over basically everything. We'll get a little more into this when we talk about our prop bet. But my concern with the Colts, beyond all the reasons I said to like them, is that they have some depth issues on both the offensive line. They don't even have a left tackle right now. If Michael Pittman is injured, this receiver room is gross. They're relying on Paris Campbell, a second-round pick, another second-round pick rookie. It's going to get ugly if Michael Pittman has to miss time, and I wouldn't be surprised if Pittman did have to miss time to see the Colts bring back a guy like T.Y. Hilton who knows this offense to sort of step in and fill and help that void. But I have the Colts going over for all the reasons I mentioned. That 9.5 win total, I wouldn't bet it because the juice is too high there. Minus 150 is really just gross. You don't want to bet it. It was a great early in the offseason pick if you could get it in, and I think I did get it in a few books, but just something to keep in mind. So my prop pick for the Colts, as I mentioned, is really just all about Michael Pittman being a superstar talent and having that connection with Matt Ryan. I think Matt Ryan is as good of juice for any receiver as there is. This is a guy who has repeatedly produced top 5 receivers in this league, just in terms of target share, guys who are just really producing at a high level. Julio Jones has had his challenges in the red zone. Matt Ryan has had his own challenges in the red zone over the last 5 years. And we've seen him struggle to get his big-bodied receiver the ball in Julio Jones. By contrast, Calvin Ridley was a touchdown machine over his young career in Atlanta. Part of that was just the fact that Matt Ryan trusted him and developed that connection early on. Michael Pittman is the only game in town. I don't believe in Paris Campbell, and I don't believe that there's going to be really anyone else besides maybe Gigantor on the Colts, Mo Alley Cox, competing for red zone targets. So if you're telling me right now that Michael Pittman's going to be the primary red zone target on this offense, I don't see any world in which he stays healthy and does not go over 6.5 receiving touchdowns. I think it's minus 120 right now for Pittman to go over 6.5 receiving touchdowns, but I think that is as much of a lock as there is. Maybe my favorite prop bet we've done this entire season or off season. Michael Pittman is going to score, I think, double-digit touchdowns this year. If you can cash that ticket in right now over 6.5 touchdowns, I believe it's free money. So what are you waiting for? Log in your app. Do it now.